Yeah, the numbers alone are staggering. Spokane Public Schools reported more than 4,800 incidents where a student was either isolated in a small padded room or restrained somehow during the school day. Now, if you come over here, we can give this a little more perspective. We start looking at the student population. Seattle is by far the biggest district in the state. They have almost twice as many students as the Spokane district. But as you can see, they only had about 500 incidents of isolation and restraint, where Spokane had almost 5,000. So when we first started asking Spokane schools why their numbers are almost 10 times higher, we were told that it was likely because of over-reporting. But as I started digging into it, I found many parents of special education students who say isolation and restraint are still being used way more than they should be.
People didn't even know about it. Isolation, it's almost like it's, in the dark or kind of off in a corner.
Isolation rooms have been used at public schools for decades. Sometimes called safety rooms or quiet rooms, they're intended as a tool to separate students who may be a harm to themselves or others. But many parents say they've seen firsthand how isolation rooms often make situations worse, not better.
He just wants to be like everybody else.
This Spokane mom didn't want to show her face on camera, but says her son, who's been diagnosed with autism, has been placed in isolation repeatedly since starting kindergarten just a few years ago.
When did that start?
When he started in a classroom that had a safety room.
So basically, as soon as it became an option, they started using it.
Absolutely.
How many times would you say?
Well, I know it's over 100 times, maybe 150.
How has that impacted your child?
He's not the same little boy he used to be. Sometimes he shuts out and he doesn't want to talk.
In 2015, a change to state law was passed requiring schools to report each and every time restraint and isolation is used. But sometimes, Mom says, it's hard hearing the truth.
And I'll ask the teacher, and she would say something like, he was crying and then he fell asleep and he was there for hours. I wish I could have been there to fix it.
Still, she is adamant it's not the students who need to be fixed, but rather the system.
I'm worried that it's becoming a common practice.
Nikki Lockwood is an outspoken advocate for families and students with special needs. She launched the Every Student Counts Alliance after one of her daughters was diagnosed with autism.
In 6th grade, she got suspended, and it was because the school was not following her IEP. After that day, when I realized that was illegal and she shouldn't have done that, I definitely became an advocate with a capital A.
She's now pushing for more special ed resources for schools and families and better training for educators to use alternative methods of behavior modification with the goal of preventing the need for isolation in the first place.
It's isolation and suspension instead of education.
It's something Cindy Edwards knows well. Her son with special needs bounced through 6 different schools in the Spokane area before finally ending up in homeschooling. She acknowledges her son has had severe behavioral issues with sometimes violent outbursts, but she tells me repeated isolation only made him worse and pushed him farther and farther behind in his schoolwork.
He had to report there for a whole month. Every day he had to go there, stay at least 4 or 5 hours there. They would let him out for...
In the isolation room?
Uh-huh.
For 4 to 5 hours?
Yeah. He wouldn't do any of his work. He just shut down.
State law says isolation is only supposed to be used when a student is an imminent threat to themselves or others. But all of the parents I talk to say it's routinely used for other reasons, sometimes as simple as not following directions.
How many times are we talking isolation and restraint?
I would say probably about 30.
Do you think that 30 times it was an imminent threat to himself or others, or do you think it was overused?
It was overused. It was to put him out of the classroom so they didn't have to deal with them.
Now, it is important to note that isolation is not used in every Spokane school. In fact, only 17 of the district's 52 schools even have an isolation room. But in certain places, as you can see, it is used a lot. So these are the top 5 with about 250 to 350 incidents of isolation alone. Perhaps what is even more telling is exactly how many students are affected by these isolations. If you take a look at 2 schools in particular, Audubon and Balboa. So Audubon had 2 students and about 35 incidents of isolation. Balboa had more than 300 incidents of isolation among just 3 students. So that amounts to more than 100 for each of those students at best. Does that seem like too much?
It seems like in the case of Balboa that those numbers might not be accurate. It seems like a lot for just 3 students, but it really speaks to the individual nature of the situation and of the students. Each situation is very, very different, and so to really be able to judge just based upon the data itself is not really a good measure of what's happening.
The district also says it's working to make sure staff in the district understand exactly what qualifies as isolation and when it should be used.
But really the data is there for our use to be able to understand the situations, understand the uses.
So what have you come to understand about almost 5,000 incidents of restraint and isolation for the 2016-2017 school year?
Well, there's definitely opportunity to find other ways to make sure that we're taking the time out the student needs, removing them from the situation, removing them from stimuli, but finding other ways to do that.
But SPS insists that isolation is sometimes the only effective way of controlling certain students.
911, what are you reporting?
I have a student here at Shadle, a special needs student that's in the safety room and is hitting her head on the safety room window.
This Facebook post in December shocked many in the Spokane community. Katie Pope, a 15-year-old girl with autism placed in isolation at Shadle Park High School. That's her screaming in the background of this call to 911 given to KREM 2 by Katie's father, Richard.
Does she need medical attention?
We're unsure. It's not safe to open the room at this point.
And when Katie emerged, she was covered in bruises from hitting herself against the steel door. Because while the rest of the room is padded to prevent kids from hurting themselves, the isolation room door at Shadle was not.
Imagine hitting yourself against a unpadded steel door repeatedly with such force that the person observing it admits that he was amazed that she didn't break bones in her face.
Richard says he immediately pulled his daughter out of Spokane Public Schools, taking Katie back to Bellevue, where they now live.
She shouldn't have been there. It should have been padded. If she injured herself, they should have let her out immediately.
And when I reached out to Washington's Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, or OSPI, I'm told Spokane's numbers for isolation and restraint immediately stood out. But they do believe at least some instances were over-reported and should not have been counted.
And so what do you think does Spokane need to be doing differently beyond understanding what the correct definition is of isolation? What else needs to be done to bring those numbers down?
So I would just say making sure that all of the school staff who are involved in students who have been restrained or isolated, and then making sure that they have kind of a tool chest of other strategies that could be used. We only want to use restraint and isolation when there are no other options.
The agency tells me it's now sending a specialist over this spring from Olympia to Spokane and other districts to help educate special education staff.
These are always last resorts. So
the district says it too is constantly looking for ways to improve, from the way it reports isolation to the isolation rooms themselves.
What about the incident at Shadle, for example, and the young woman who was severely injured, throwing herself up against a steel door that's not padded? Have you guys made any changes to certain rooms to make sure that kids can't hurt themselves?
Yeah, padding's been added to that room in particular, and that's a situation where again, we're going to learn from everything that we experience, and moving forward, we're going to add padding to that room and any others that might not have it.
It is welcome news to these parents, but they agree it cannot stop there.
You're trying everything as a parent, and there's not the individual training out there to say, hey, we can help you in this area, other than saying it's just your kid.
Parents need resources. You have to speak out. It's really hard to do the first time, but then you get better at it. And when it's your child, you do what you have to do to try to get them what they need.
Because they say all children deserve an education, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's also the law.
We can choose to do differently, and we can do better.
And one more thing that is important to remember is the 2016-17 school year was the first year this data was even taken. So OSPI says this really is just a starting point to see where each district is at, and they agree it will take more time to make sure that every district in the state is using the same criteria when it comes to reporting isolation and restraint. Now, the new numbers for the 2017-2018 school year are expected out in May of this year, and we'll make sure to keep track of that data for you as it becomes available. In the studio tonight, Whitney Ward KREM 2 News.